Good afternoon, and welcome to the College of Continuing and Professional Studies webinar, Building Resilient Teams, Growing Stronger Through Adversity. Thank you so much for joining us. Next slide, please. It's a pleasure to have you all here this afternoon. My name is Lisa Beckham, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. If you have future questions about this webinar or other programs that we offer, our contact information will be on the last slide of this presentation. Next slide, please. There are some logistical items I'd like to discuss before we begin. I ask that you please submit your questions throughout the webinar so we can address them during the Q&A portion of this presentation. To submit your questions during the webinar, go to the description on the bottom of the YouTube video and click on the link to the question form. There's also live captioning available for viewing if you click on the CC button towards the bottom right side of the screen. Next slide, please. We will send an email within a week with a link to the recording of this webinar. The link will be sent to the email address you submitted during registration. Next slide, please. I'd like to introduce the topic for today's webinar, Building Resilient Teams. With an unexpected challenges around every corner, the need for teams to be resilient grows more important each day. Yet resilience can be elusive. Simply defined, resilience is the capacity to navigate change and stress in a way that promotes growth instead of burnout. Resilient teams are stronger and capable of taking on more and bigger challenges. So what makes the difference between teams that consistently meet challenges head-on versus those that flounder? In this webinar, you'll learn strategies that facilitate healthy teamwork, especially in the middle of unexpected challenges, how most team leaders unknowingly sabotage teamwork, key characteristics and mindsets of resilient teams, and how to unleash creativity and performance in the midst of a rapidly changing environment. It's an honor to introduce today's webinar presenter, Stephanie McGovern. Stephanie applies skills and techniques honed over 20 years developing leaders, coaching, and helping create and maintain high-performing teams at leading manufacturing companies. She also has extensive experience in building employee ownership and commitment to organizational goals and with managing a department during times of rapid change. Thank you so much for joining us today, Stephanie, and welcome.
Thank you. Well, I'm really glad to be here with you today. In April, I was asked to think about a topic I could do something about teamwork for a webinar, and the word resiliency popped into my mind. And I had no idea how important that would be, as COVID has become clear that COVID is a marathon and not a sprint. So I'm really excited to actually share with some of the things that I discovered as I was doing research on this, and also just pulling from my own experience, coaching people and also in my own life. I'll just tell you a little bit more about my background. My undergraduate degree was in humanities, and I used to get people asking me, well, what are you going to do with that? And I would joke with them that, well, I am a certified human and there aren't too many of us around. And as I've been studying resiliency, I'm realizing that resiliency is really at the core, kind of the deepest sense of what it means to be human, both in terms of our capacity, potential, courage, strength to overcome difficulties, and also in our acceptance to just actually accept our own limitations as humans. So, and what that means day to day is kind of what we're going to explore and get into. So I'm going to start off talking about just some basics around resiliency and especially individual resiliency, and then I'll layer that in terms of what does that mean in terms of teams. And as I've been thinking about this topic, I've reflected, over the course of my career, that phrase that people are our greatest asset, and how easily that rolls off the tongue. But I think in these challenging times, we're really invited to say, what does it mean to really support and care for one another, both in a personal sense, but also in terms of the infrastructure, direction, structure, kinds of things that we put in place to make work easier. So we'll be addressing kind of both of those. So one day, this was about 6 weeks ago, I just decided to write down all the different things that had happened in our global environment. And within 30 seconds, this list came out. And if we were going to brainstorm here, we could come up, I'm sure, with a lot of other kinds of things. But there's so many things that have happened and layered one after another that it takes a lot of our psychic capacity to actually navigate this. And then I started thinking, well, what is it that these kind of things are impacting us in terms of personally? So, you'll recognize some of these in your own life. Routines disrupted, and those normal things that we've been able to do to kind of get recharged or de-stressed or whatever sometimes aren't as available. And the lack of separation between home and work, has become really blurred for many, many people. And then I hear a lot of things around too much isolation, not enough connection, and then other people saying, I don't have enough isolation. I'm kind of living in this bubble with my family, and there isn't enough space to actually find quiet. Illness or death of loved ones, either from COVID or other kinds of things. My 91-year-old mom died in August, not of COVID, but of a kind of broken hip. And just navigating what does it mean to have these rituals of people dying in terms of funerals, and even the positive things around marriage and graduations, and those rituals that normally are markers in our life are gone. And then we're all swimming in this environment of more stress, and then trying to support customers and things. And again, I'm sure if we talked, you could put a lot more things on your list around this. But I just thought it's important because sometimes we get used to this quote new normal, not realizing that there's just so many layers of stress that we're dealing with. So let's talk about what individual resiliency is. And Lisa shared that at the beginning. It's the capacity to navigate change and stress in a way that produces growth instead of burnout. Now, what's interesting, I found an article about the medical profession in the Harvard Business Review, and they were talking about in 2003, there were 307 scientific articles about the term burnout in the National Library of Medicine. In 2009, there were 560, and in 2019, it was 2,137. And that was before COVID even hit. And so the other thing I had seen was kind of an inventory of burnout. How do you kind of measure burnout? And if any of you are interested, it's the Maslow burnout inventory. But it talks about things like workload, control, reward, community, fairness, values. And all of those things have really been challenged because of COVID. So why we want resiliency is it really helps us turn challenges into opportunities that lead to innovation. So many of you may know that the Chinese symbol for crisis is actually translated into opportunity. And a lot of things that when things kind of get tossed up in the air, when we really start to look at, well, how are we going to do this? It actually leads to a lot of innovation, which it already has started to do that in many cases. It really helps us renew our energy by getting us in touch with what's truly important to us. And so we don't always, it's easy in the day-to-day to lose sight of that. And it's almost like the idea of having a pitcher of water to drink. And when you're done drinking, it's the end of the water versus When we're tapped into what really truly matters to us, it's like there's a spring of water that we're tapped into us within ourselves. And the third thing is that it really helps give courage to act in the face of uncertainty. And it was always important to be able to know to act even when we didn't have all the information. But as uncertainty has increased exponentially, the ability to be able to look at what is the reality of the situation and what do we need to do to take thoughtful action is important. And then resiliency is really the ability to recover quickly. So that kind of bounce back factor. So when we have a disappointment, something happens, how do we bounce back in a way that doesn't ignore the disappointment or the problem or the challenge, but helps us deal with it in a more effective way? So here's some dilemmas around building resiliency. And at the base of it is kind of biology. So the first thing, in the midst of a lot of change and stress, I say, it's like we are often not in our right mind. It's like just when we need our best thinking, it's actually hard to access. And here's why. So I'm just going to give you a brief tutorial on neuroscience, and some of you may be familiar with this. But there's kind of four main parts of the brain. The first one is the reptilian brain, that is like our autonomic nervous system. And it is the primary focus is safety. So am I safe? And the reptilian brain loves knowns, loves things that, clear expectations, agendas, routine, all those kind of things. The limbic brain is really the part of us that is about belonging. And that part of us that needs really that sense of trust and respect. And we've seen lots of evidence with issues of respect in the workplace and in the world, just for each other and our differences and things. And that is, partly what that limbic brain is really craving. Now, something magic happens when we have those needs for safety and connection met. It opens up the higher parts of our brain, the higher thinking levels of our brain. And we get access to our neocortex, which is all about the problem solving part of our brain and being able to look at things and figure out what to do and meet challenges, and creates that sense of clarity about what we need to do going forward. And then the prefrontal lobes are the part of our brain that is really about innovation and vision and what could be and possibilities. So this is the brain at its best. And that responsive brain is what we need most when we're in the middle of change and stress in our current situation. Now, what happens though is that when those needs aren't met, we get a whole different pattern going on with our brain. The first part is when we don't have a sense of safety, we feel that threat. And think about, just the threat of going to the grocery store. Simple things that normally would not even enter our consciousness now become a threat. So it takes a lot of energy, and that reptilian brain part of it is always like going, is it safe? Is it safe? Is it safe? And then think of what's happened in terms of so much social isolation and people working from home and that lack of connection. And so without those two needs met, we get absence of clarity and commitment. And what we get instead is we get confusion. So, think if you've, had somebody, you told them something and they didn't, they have to tell them again and they go, I already told you that. And it's like they didn't hear it. They were in confusion. And then rather getting that commitment, we get a sense of apathy. It's like this feeling almost of powerlessness, and what difference does it make? So this is kind of the biology of what we're dealing with. So another thing that happens with this kind of reactive brain is our thinking starts to narrow and focusing on either or versus both and. So think of the, biology of a lion chasing us, and we need to focus up, and we need to get away from that lion. So we need really narrow focused thinking. But we also need this both and of all these different polarities. And for some of you who have heard of polarity management, it's the idea of what are those things that we need both of, and how can we get the best of both? So this is really important when, especially with teams, when we're navigating things of sometimes when I've seen teams out of balance, it's because they've got too much of one or the other of these. Now, also in the midst of change, leaders do something that appears to them to be helping, but actually is not. They do what I call suck up responsibility rather than empowering others. And this comes from some work from Barry Oshry, if any of you know him, that have really studied power and influence in organizations. But it's this reflexive response to feel like I've got to do something, I've got to take charge, versus really empowering people. And a recent Gallup research that I just read on engagement and resiliency said that one of the things that makes a difference is people being involved in decision making and having kind of a choice and a say. Now, early on in the pandemic, we needed really clear directive leadership. But now, as it's been ongoing, we really need to think about how do we empower others to bring out the best in them and their contribution. In the midst of change, we end up focusing on tasks to avoid emotions. So we've got lots of layering of emotions happening. And it's easy to get that balance off of, in terms of task and relationship. And we can treat ourselves as well as other people just like objects to get work done. And this has, of course, incredible impact on our own energy, on other people. It can erode trust. And if anybody is interested in more research on this, the Arbinger Institute out of Salt Lake City has done a great job of really looking at this idea of treating other people and ourselves like objects and what it does to energy and trust and teamwork. So some facts about resiliency. So first of all, I just wanted to start off with this quote by Nelson Mandela. And he says, "Do not judge me by my success. Judge me by how many times I fell down and got back up again." And I think of the amazing good that he did in the world because he was willing to get back up. And at the same time, when I read that, I'm very inspired. But in the back of my brain also comes up, well, I'm no Nelson Mandela. And yet, here's the good news. Resiliency can be developed. It's like a muscle. And it's something that if we understand the principles of it and we practice it, we can get better at. So here is some information from an article by Marcus Buckingham in the Harvard Business Review in September. It says, "What really makes us resilient?" And just to highlight some highlights from that is resilience is not related to gender, age, or country, which I thought was really fascinating because sometimes we've got biases around that. We develop resilience when we are forced to meet unavoidable suffering head on. Now, I don't know about you, but I try to avoid suffering at all costs. And yet this idea of really stepping in to what is going on in the situation that is difficult and facing reality. And what they found was by facing reality, it helps us know what we're capable of, what actually is the strength. And some of you have heard of the term grit in the last few years as well. It's like that capacity to really be determined and persistent in the face of difficulty to achieve long-term goals. And the truth is that the real is often less scary than the imagined. Our imaginations can go wild about things. So I love this quote that said, "The fears we don't face become our limits." So when we're just trying to avoid all this kind of difficulty versus saying, okay, what's the reality here? What is it I need to do? What do I need to face into right now and work through? So some keys to resilience, and I'm going to go through these individually, but it's about accepting what is uncontrollable. And we as humans don't like to do that very often. Interestingly, this theme of balancing realism and optimism came up over and over again. Really being able to draw on your inner resources and then actively managing risks. So we'll chat about each one of those. So accepting what is. So I thought of the opposite of that is kind of resisting what is, and thought of the metaphor of yelling at the rain. Or for those of you in Minnesota, we had snow last week in October, and it's like yelling at the snow. It drains our energy, leaves us less energy to actually address the situation. So I'm just going to change this from rain to snow. And this was me last week. I don't like snow. I wish it wasn't snowing. My day would be better if it wasn't snowing. My day is ruined by this snow. Versus what acceptance is, yep, it's snowing. And can you feel the difference of the energy drain? And the other thing acceptance does is it helps us really look at the reality of where we are. And we can only start from where we are. We can't start from where we think we are. So kind of looking at that, and we'll talk a little bit more of that when we go into the next topic around realism as well. Some implications for leaders, just kind of a side note here. People don't function well when leaders gloss over reality. It is actually more frightening because our imaginations run wild, again, as I mentioned. There's a tendency to want to rush back to normal somehow, okay, we'll just do this and we'll get back to normal. But what they found was it's much better to actually describe the actual threat in detail and what's required to create the necessary changes. And then describe how the direction you're heading and the new normal will actually protect us better. So that ability to be, kind of clear about that versus trying to sugarcoat it or things like that. All right, so the second piece here is this balancing realism and optimism. And, we have this amazing, country in terms of our founding forefathers that saw the possibilities of what America could be. And it's really built on a foundation of optimism and hope that things can get better. Well, it turns out you can get too much of a good thing. Someone coined or told me about the phrase the other day of toxic positivity, where we just want to reframe things quickly and like, oh, well, it's not that bad. And we'll get back to this and we'll do this and we'll do this. What is interesting is, I don't know how many of you have heard of James Stockdale, but he was an admiral that was captured. And he spent 7 years as a prisoner of war. And he was being interviewed, and he said, I never doubted that I would get out and that I also would prevail in the end and turn the experience into a defining event in my life. And he said, actually, in retrospect, I would not trade. But at the same time, he said, this is a very important lesson. You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can't afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they may be. And when someone said, well, who are the ones that didn't make it out? He said it was the optimists. He said it was the ones that said, we're going to be out by Christmas, and then we're going to be out by Easter, and then we're going to be out by Thanksgiving, and then Christmas would come again. And he said they died of a broken heart. So that ability to really balance realism with optimism, I think, is such a core skill, and you'll see it as a theme in terms of what we're going to look at. So the truth is, I find this inspiration that although the world is full of suffering and it's more apparent now in so many ways than ever before. It's also full of examples of people overcoming it. All right, the other thing is drawing on inner resources. So there was some research done, gosh, I think I probably heard about this maybe 20 years ago. A friend of mine who taught gifted kids told me about it. And she said that the research said is that people don't build self-esteem by having people tell them they did a good job. They build self-esteem by people really being able to face challenges and work together and overcome them. And this is a quote by Geber Tully, and I don't know how many of you have heard of him, but he actually was a kind of self-made computer scientist, and he runs a week-long camp for kids. At least he did. I'm not sure what he's doing during COVID, but he would bring them together and have them solve like amazing problems that they had no idea of things they could do, like build a roller coaster or a 3-story treehouse or whatever. And he gave them a lot of permission to really use their creativity. His principles were let children be the co-author of their education, trust them. The default answer is yes, focus on habits and character, and agree that everything is interesting. And that's what he found really gave them the strength to work through these difficult problems. So another piece here is I just tried to capture some qualities of resilient people, both from my own experience and things that I've read, but ability to face fears, which we've talked about, the ability to let go of the past and keep not wishing that it were like it was before. Resilient people have a sense of an internal locus of control. They really believe they focus on those things where they can make a difference, even though there might be things that are uncontrollable, that they have accepted. They're saying, okay, but what is within my sphere of control, or what is in my sphere of influence? The fourth one is adaptable. And this reminds me also of this man I worked with, Barry Oshry, who studied power and influence for 40 years in organizations. And his definition of power was the ability to set an intention to make something happen that you want to have happen, knowing it'll never turn out exactly as you want, and being willing to work with whatever does happen. And I find that such a practical definition of power, especially in light of the environment we're working with. The other thing I found was really the ability to struggle and willingness to struggle with difficult problems, and at the same time ask for help. So what I see often with people is I see people asking for help too soon before they've been willing to struggle. It's like, I don't get it. Tell me what to do. And I also see people who maybe struggle too long on their own. And I think this is fascinating because a lot of times you think of resilient people as being like really independent people and whatever. But that ability to know when to ask for help, who to ask for help, realizing that the challenges we're facing are not going to be solved, with some individual brain. It's like we really need our collective wisdom here. And then the other one that I have found so true in my experience is physical capacity. And this is both, as you can think of physical health, physical strength. But as a friend of mine always says, no one has courage when they're tired. And that ability to be just the basics of getting sleep and good food and exercise, as difficult as it may be at times, is really core, of course, to staying healthy and just in terms of fighting COVID, but it also really taps us into this emotional and spiritual strength to really keep our brains functioning, our hearts open, so that we can really nurture the wisdom of all of that. The fourth thing here is to actively manage risk. So this is almost like the opposite. We've got accept what's uncontrollable. Now we are going to actively manage the risk, though. So our reactive brain naturally focuses on what could eat us. And we can get stuck there focusing on things that are out of our control and start feeling somewhat powerless over our environment. So this is back to those resilient people have that internal locus of control. And, focusing on what is controllable and anticipation of challenges. So a really common thing around this is scenario planning, and many of you may have, been doing this with your teams already. But what if this happens? What would we do? What if this happens? What would we do? Now, the value of this is it really forces creative thinking. And it also gives this sense of that we do have some control that we're going to exercise, even though things are unknown, we don't know what's coming, but we are going to do what we can to be prepared. And even if none of the scenarios ever happen, just the exercise of exercising that creative thinking can really spark innovation things. And it can also just give this sense of that we are doing what we can. So one of the things that I've discovered around fear is there's a couple of things that fear can do for us. Sometimes fear just runs amok, and it really is going into that unbelievable imagination about different things. And that usually is not helpful. But fear can also lead us to take action on what we can do. So taking all that nervous energy and anxiety and whatever and say, okay, so what can I do with this? What is within my sphere of control? So those are just some general principles. And we're going to layer this now with some of the things around teams, and then what can you do in teams? So building a foundation. So this, the definition of team resiliency, the capacity to anticipate, so that's that managing risk, and overcome challenges to create sustained team performance. So it's the ability to navigate the environment in a way that you can keep your team performing and creating results and whatever, even though there's all this kind of churn in the external environment. So some building blocks of successful teams. So this is, basically the infrastructure. Now, what's interesting is a lot of times when I talk to people about teamwork, they think of interpersonal behaviors, like the willingness to help each other out and the initiative and determination and whatever, which is all true. And there is also this other piece of structure and process and things that help people really deliver their best. So I just want to briefly go through these and then talk about why these are so important, especially in the midst of what's happening. So obviously purpose, many of you have heard, like the why gives a sense of meaning. Something I read recently about the medical field was they found that people who even were able to focus on tasks that were meaningful to them and gave them a sense of purpose, even 20% of the time, really helped them overcome burnout. So that ability to keep why in people's forefront. Then direction, which is the goals, the measures, the milestones, the progress. One of the universal things as humans that creates a sense of motivation is seeing a sense of progress. And oftentimes in change, because we're changing so quickly, we lose that sense. So whatever you can do to help give people perspective, context around progress, what progress are we making? And then execution. So how are we going to work together? And this is when I have a self-assessment that I use in a leading teams class that I just have people take their individual team, kind of self-assess where their strengths and weaknesses are with these building blocks. And execution is often the lowest score because there's so many moving parts to execution in terms of process and structure and process and roles and also decision making and conflict and just how do we navigate operating ground rules, what are our rules of engagement about how we're going to work together, clarifying expectations, and then the connection piece, which is who, so that in times of trouble you can really trust people and they've got your back. One of the most effective things I ever did with the team, I had worked with them quite a bit and there were just all sorts of issues and nothing was quite gelling. And so we did an exercise around stress and asked people to think of who are you at your best in terms of your strengths? And what happens when you get under stress? How would I, as your teammate, know you're under stress? What would I see or hear? And then what can others do when you get in that place to support you? And this team that was really disjointed, even though we had done a lot of the basic foundations, for some reason, it's exactly what this team needed. And they were able to own where they were feeling stressed themselves rather than thinking other people are making me stressed. And also, people really started to step up and they knew what to do to help somebody out. So that connection piece can be important. And then really are we delivering the results that we're meant to do? And how are we tracking that? And how are we improving, everything in order to achieve that? So some importance of this strong foundation. So in, times of stress and change, we need these strong relationships to really work together more than ever. So just like in that team I described. So yes, people are stressed, but how can we take that stressful environment and really support each other? Number two, the whole idea of having that sense of purpose gives meaning to suffering. And what I found with myself and so many other people is that I don't mind suffering. I just don't like meaningless suffering. So we want to know that there's some reason we're going through this difficulty and that it's going to make a difference somehow. Clear direction is important because we can lose focus easily. So that reminder of, goals and milestones and directions and also adapting those in the moment as, things change. And then the clear structure, process, roles, all those things around execution can really give a sense of stability in a very changing environment, saying, yes, these things are changing, but here's what we're doing to create some sense of stability within our team. So here's some ideas for building team resilience. So I'll go through these one by one. And I just tried to look at these and I thought, what is it that when I really see some of these people using the building blocks well, and then what are the pieces that you add on that really make a difference here? These are the things that came to mind. So the first one is psychological safety. And the definition I like is a climate in which people feel comfortable expressing and being themselves. So if you think of all the stress going on in the world, the fact that you could come to a team and you can be who you are and express what's on your mind and be supported for it is really important if you want a high functioning team. And if you want to read more about this, Amy Edmondson from Harvard has done a lot of really good research around psychological safety. Personal check-ins at meetings. Sometimes, in the heat of the battle and, busyness of work, we forget to do this. But one of the things I've done is just giving people a list of kind of icebreaker questions to choose from. And some people just roll your eyes when, you see that icebreaker piece. But if you give people good questions that are meaningful and thoughtful, and they get to pick what's important to them. They get to share something. And then also just more one-on-ones to check in with people. One of the things I've noticed in my classes as I've taught is people really wanting people to just hear their experience and be able to be heard for the challenges they're overcoming and what they're dealing with. Even if nothing can be done about it, that ability to just be heard, and that goes into that second one there about that deep listening. Really, that I call it knee-to-knee listening with somebody, where they really feel heard and seen. And it's a huge need that we all have as human beings. And when we get busy, it's easy to forget that. Encourage sharing of highs and lows. Some people, some of us get stuck on the lows, some of us get stuck on the highs, but having that blend of the honesty of sharing the lows, and then the hope and the excitement of sharing the highs when you've overcome challenges. This was a very consistent message about really actively doing sessions around lessons learned, mistakes, concerns, really being able to get that out in a way that we can make course corrections and build on past failures and past successes. Foster compassion for others when they are being reactive. It's easy to, if somebody starts getting reactive, I call it triggered. It's easy to get triggered by someone who's triggered. And so really understanding, wow, they are having a tough time. Those kind of things can be really helpful. And helping other people see things from other points of view, and that need for empathy. And then just the ability to be transparent and open. The more I found that when I'm transparent and open and vulnerable, the more that gives permission for other people to share as well. So again, we've got our theme around kind of reality and hope. So again, this theme around kind of lessons learned, really be taking time to summarize other people's reality. So sometimes when we hear somebody's reality that is very different than ours, it's easy to go into the yeah buts. Well, yeah, but that's not true because of that or that or that. And if I can just logic my way, I can show them why this is not logical. But other people's realities are important to them. And to be able to summarize somebody's, perspective and say, wow, it sounds like what you're seeing is this. Is that right? Yeah. Well, that's interesting because I'm seeing something different. Here's what I'm seeing. So I didn't discount this other person's reality. I just brought it actually more to life, as well as brought in my reality. And then we've got a better foundation in terms of really building on each other's ideas. So the regular sharing of kind of wins and challenges and having a regular process to do that, I think is really, and making both of them welcome in your team meetings. Reminding teams of how they overcame past challenges. So sometimes when the big challenge is looming large, we go, oh my gosh, how are we ever going to get through this? But almost at the nature of every challenge, we have a moment like that, where we go, oh no, how are we going to deal with this? And yet in the past, we did deal with it. So, reminding people of their strengths and how they, worked with that. And then when people do share, especially the reality piece, sometimes we can, because sometimes it's uncomfortable to hear the reality of things. It's like, thank them for sharing, their honest sharing. And the other thing is you don't necessarily have to fix somebody's reality. If somebody is sharing something that's really hard for them, maybe that's all they need to do is share it. Now, there also may be something that collectively the team decides to do from it, but just thank people for sharing their perspective. It just gives people more permission. The third piece here is increasing communication. So what's interesting is in the absence of communication, our brains do a very interesting thing. Tends to fill in the gaps with negative, kind of dark stories. So we want to fill in the communication gaps as quickly as we can with messages that create alignment and, kind of future focus. So increase your frequency and repetition of key messages. Um, Many times, one of my jobs, I used to work at Honeywell in the late 80s, and I was the workforce reduction manager when we were going through lots and lots of layoffs. And one of the things we really focused on was when people are in a shock or a situation, it's like they need a repetition of key messages, whether they were the ones being laid off or the people staying, because our brains go into that reactive place and we often go into confusion. And if you are having trouble, like sometimes remembering things, it's like it's because we've got so many layers of stress going on. Give context to what is happening. So this is the ability I think really good leaders do, is they're able to pull us out of the day-to-day from time to time and give us that sense of context and meaning and progress. The other thing that really resilient teams do is they have a way of assessing people's capacity level. And it's not just workload, it's sometimes emotional capacity level, because sometimes people are just in a week of total stress. And so being able to check in with each other at the beginning of the week and what do you need and how, what's going on and whatever. Increase the opportunities, for that honest two-way dialogue. That is, key. One of the things I've noticed is that when people don't have that two-way dialogue, they easily spin into negativity, and you get these pockets of drama and negativity going that could easily be remedied if we just had honest ways to surface challenges and things. And then the other thing resilient teams do is they have a really good way to deal with conflict. So they know, they expect conflict. They have a process of working through conflict. People have conflict resolution skills. They know about listening to points of view. They know about really trying to understand, what's happening, and then brainstorming, and coming up with those third options that nobody really saw coming, that can really lead to innovation. So relationship building, this is, key besides that structural foundation building blocks we talked about. The research shows a lot about recognition. And it's just recognizing what people are doing because they feel seen and they feel heard. And especially for those of you working remotely, this is important. I read some research that said in times of stress, the need for recognition goes up about 50%. And again, this is not good job recognition. This is, wow, I noticed you really faced into this difficult situation. And here's the good that came of it. And I really appreciate the extra effort you put forth. So it's really seeing the nitty gritty of what someone did and the impact it made and reflecting that back. Informal opportunity, we talked about active listening, just that the time to chat with people in a meaningful way about real things, so finding those things. And then obviously there's lots of things out there about just trying to find efficient, effective tools for collaborating. Zoom fatigue is a real thing. I'm seeing it more and more in terms of the work I do. And so finding ways that either, help deal with Zoom fatigue or just any sort of, kind of virtual connecting you're doing. Something I've read just talks about sometimes more just picking up the phone and talking one-on-one sometimes is really much less stressful on that. All right, and then the last thing here is just encouraging learning. So we're in an immense time of learning. Everything's kind of been thrown up in the air, and we're trying to put the pieces together in a way that makes sense. But this ability to say, how do we keep learning and make it okay? So some of you may have heard the term growth versus a fixed mindset, and this was some work by a woman named Carol Dweck from Stanford University. I think it was 2006 she came out with this. But it's the idea, a growth mindset is the idea that I'm not good at something yet, but I can learn it. And this comes from her research with neuroscience that said, even as we get, later on into adulthood, where we thought a lot of the neural, synapses were more fixed, we can keep learning, we can keep growing. There's lots of ways. I remember in March when I realized that most of my work is done online, or was done in person, and I thought, oh my gosh, how am I going to do my work? And I realized that I was going to have to use Zoom and learn all that. And it was, at first I thought, oh my gosh, I'll never learn that, which is a fixed mindset. And I had a little pity party for myself. And then the next morning I just woke up and I go, okay, I am going to practice an hour a day on this. It's like a muscle, like working out, and it's going to be uncomfortable, but I'm going to learn this. So that kind of thing is something that helps resiliency. And then give people permission to struggle and not know, to be able to say, this is hard, this is difficult. Have people share something they're proud of learning. This is a great icebreaker question. I would throw it probably in with a bunch of other ones that they could choose from, but to really reinforce that, yes, if we're really learning something, it doesn't necessarily mean it's easy. And there, is some struggle to true learning. And so making that okay. And then really supporting experimentation with different ways, different approaches, giving people some room to experiment. And again, that sense of control and autonomy. One of the things they did was a study on people working from home versus working in the office and who was happier. And it wasn't about home or office. It was like who had a choice about where they wanted to work and why. And so that ability to give people autonomy to experiment and try things and, use some of their creativity, I think is really important and helpful. And then the last thing here I will just share is, this is a quote by Viktor Frankl. And some of you may know he was in the concentration camps in World War II. And he was known for going around kind of giving his last piece of bread to other people because it was a thing he felt like he could have some control over that gave him a sense of meaning. And he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning when he came out of the concentration camps. But here's what he says: we must never forget that we may also find meaning in life, even when confronted with a hopeless situation, when facing a fate that cannot be changed. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. So I hope you have really, whether there's something in the presentation or something that just catalyzed in your experience that you forgot or that you needed today, that really builds that sense of internal resilience and ideas to really build that resilience in your teamwork. And just wish you the best, because we need resilient people in teams right now. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for your wisdom, especially on this topic during this time. Really appreciate it. So we're actually now going to move towards the Q&A portion of this webinar. And I will say it has been very difficult choosing some questions. We had so many really, really great questions. So my apologies if I wasn't able to choose yours. The first one I will ask is from a viewer who said, Stephanie, you've been coaching and training on this subject for a while. Do you see that resilience among the human race, or more specifically in the US, is less than it was 20, 30, or 40 years ago?
I can't really speak to kind of globally versus the US. That's not been my experience. But I will say, it's very hard to speak of something kind of universally. But what I would say is anybody who's had to face into really difficult situations, I see has developed more resiliency. And there are, populations of people and whatever that just, things have kind of worked for, and there haven't been a lot of challenges. And from that sense, I do think people have lost their sense of their own resiliency, and what's really capable and what's possible. But I know lots of people that, even though there hasn't been a global pandemic or the other things we're dealing with, have faced really personal tragedies and difficulties. And that ability to really draw on those inner resources and things in the face of that, and the courage to believe in and trust something beyond yourself. I think, I always say you can trust yourself, you can trust the process, or you can trust something bigger than yourself. And those are the ones that people that I find really have developed the most resilience.
Thank you. Our second question is from a viewer that says, I think my team is interested in the outcomes of being resilient, but not in devoting resources to create the space for that to happen. Yeah. How can I encourage this to be more commonplace and be considered to be real work as much as tasks on a job description?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. Wouldn't we all like that? I love to, sometimes when I'm coaching people, I say, would you like $1 million? And everyone goes, yeah, I'd like $1 million. Would you like to do what it takes to get $1 million? Not so much. So I think sometimes when we're trying to help people change or see the goodness that can happen from changing habits, is really helping people see of what happens if we don't pay attention to this. What is going to happen long term? Because in the short term, we can kind of endure anything. But as different things start happening, what happens if we don't start developing some of this longer term capacity for dealing with things? And one of the things I've learned about change is that it needs a combination of the dissatisfaction with the current environment. So sometimes really helping bring that to light. Here's what's going to happen if we keep down the path we're headed. I can really see these challenges we're not going to be prepared for. Here's a vision I see of what's possible if we put in the legwork to do it. And also, here's what I see as the next 3 steps. And make it simple for people. Let's just do one thing. Let's just start with one thing. And helping people experience the energy that comes from, a lot of times the reason we get caught in task is because it gives us a sense of energy because we completed the task and we like checking it off. But eventually, if we keep in that mode, it leads to burnout. And so being able to really pull people back and say, okay, what could we do, and help them experience what it feels like to get that, kind of hit of authentic energy. It's like, yeah, that other than just from completing a task. And I think some of the things around building teams can do that.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we can squeeze in one more. So one viewer asks, can you share the connection between resiliency and the normal change processes we go through when we experience a loss? So for example, denial, resistance, acceptance. Where and how can resilient behaviors be most effective in the change process?
Yeah, really good. This goes back to what I shared about realism and optimism, but I think that, we, in terms of the, grief process or anything that we go through, that first thing of denial is actually just a survival mechanism because we can't take it all in at once. And so resilient people respect the process. Yep, that's part of my survival mechanism. But they're willing to really take it a little bit at a time and say, okay, what do I have the capacity to look at now? This is very personal for me in terms of kind of grieving my mom over the last three months, and just taking those little pieces that I can take at one moment, and then releasing that energy. What's interesting about emotion is that it actually is energy, and the more we're willing to go through that natural cycle of the the denial, the anger, the grief, or whatever, it actually releases energy, and we have more energy available to us to really focus on those things that we do have control over. Not an easy process, but it is possible.
Well, again, thank you so much, Stephanie, for your time and your incredibly useful information. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here. Could I actually get you to share the last slide of this presentation again? So as I mentioned earlier, we will send a link to this webinar recording as well as slides within a week. Please take a moment to let us know what you thought about this webinar by clicking on the survey link in the description portion of the YouTube video. The survey is very brief, and your response will really help us shape future webinar experiences. If you enjoyed this webinar and would like to dive deeper into this topic, please consider our upcoming courses on the right side of this slide. My contact information is also available on this slide if you'd like to learn more information. Once again, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Take care, stay safe, and be well.